Item E, please.
Item 6E, waive first reading and introduce an ordinance adding Chapter 11.40 to Title 11, Buildings, Construction, and Fire Protection of the San Bruno Municipal Code, establishing floodplain management requirements.
Director.
Hi. Good evening again, Honorable Mayor and members of the council. My name is Darcy Smith, the Community and Economic Development Director. It's my pleasure to provide you with the report for the introduction of this ordinance. And one correction, I wanted to be 6B, but I got moved to 6E, and it's the last item. So the agenda for tonight is
We'll see if we can't, on the next agenda, get you moved up.
The agenda for tonight, oh, sorry, here. I was B, now I'm E. Okay, but the agenda for tonight is to first give you some background, just to bring you and the community members up to speed about the background related to the FEMA, or Federal Emergency Management Agency Flood Insurance Study reports and the flood insurance rate maps, also known as the FIRMs. And I'll provide information about the National Flood Insurance Program requirements, which are leading to these floodplain management regulations. So I'll summarize and focus on the ordinance and how it affects the city and the residents, and at the end we'll have time for any questions you may have. And while I'm presenting this item and authored the staff report, I just want to point out all the staff that worked on it in case you have questions for them later. Jimmy Tan, Public Works Director, who's been working on the FEMA mapping issue for many years, and Mark Zaffarano, the City Attorney, who's also been engaged. And Roy Bernald, who's here tonight, our Chief Building Official, also worked on the ordinance, and it's within his title of the Municipal Code. And he will have the large task of implementing the ordinance and applying it through the building permit process and also the annual reporting. So the objective for this item tonight is to waive the first reading and introduce this ordinance, which will add Chapter 11.40 to Title 11 of the San Bruno Municipal Code, and that will establish for the first time the city's floodplain management requirements. In July of 2014, this process really was initiated when FEMA completed the engineering study of the coastal hazards. That was part of a California coastal analysis and mapping project for the San Francisco Bay. And FEMA completed that on a broad level to implement the National Flood Insurance Program, which has been around since the 60s. This study resulted in updated flood insurance study reports and those firm maps for the city, which you can see here. So the FEMA study identified properties within largely the Bel Air neighborhood as potentially subject to inundation by flooding from the bay. And this is called a higher risk flood zone, and it is zone AE. There are many different zones, and this one is AE. And this map, which is shown here, also called the FIRM, was issued back in August 2015. And this kind of gives you the broader perspective of where this flooding actually occurs from. Again, it's from the bay. You can see the airport here. The airport has some levees. There's also some tidal gate structures and navigable sloughs, but you can see it kind of all moves inland in a major storm event. So I wanted to just give you some high points of the governmental process timeline. The main takeaway from this slide is that this has been an ongoing effort for many years, and the city has been working really diligently on this issue to ensure the city's interests and the community's interests are represented and voiced to FEMA. We've also worked through U.S. Congresswoman Jackie Spears' office and County Supervisor David Pine's office to express our interest in this process. And although the appeal was denied, there have been many questions posed of, well, what happens next? And so the city had an agreement with the County of San Mateo and the City of South San Francisco to study one of the flooding sources that could potentially mitigate this. It is a multi-jurisdictional effort, also involves the airport, of course. At this time, there's no identified or funded projects to move forward, but it is something the city is aware of. And all of these many years led to October 2018, when the city was officially noticed by FEMA that they'll initiate this firm map adoption process, which takes a total of 6 months. And the main requirement imposed on the city in that 6-month process is the adoption of this floodplain management ordinance. So this is the only thing the city is required to do before the maps become effective, which will be April 5th. So I want to point out some key items related to the community engagement. We've had some questions from the community raised. So we did have a community meeting, which is in August. And we also have sent out 3 informational letters to the community. We built a website, which has been active for many years, with a wealth of information, especially related to just basic questions. How do I buy flood insurance? Where do I buy it from? And we most recently informed the residents on a 3rd letter that was sent in November that there was a deadline to purchase the discounted flood insurance. And that deadline sort of starts at this point and goes for a year. So as a voluntary measure, we anticipate mailing out a 4th informational letter to these residents, informing them of that window, because that's really the critical window. And we have noticed or provided the noticing related to this floodplain management ordinance on the website. But it's really important to remember that the lenders, and not the city and not FEMA, are really the ones that communicate the requirement to purchase the insurance. It's related to mortgages that are federally insured or backed, and so the lenders are the main point of communication with the residents related to insurance. So it's really important to emphasize the need to do this ordinance. It's really driven by the city's participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. So if we don't adopt this ordinance, there are some pretty significant consequences that I outlined in the staff report. I just want to touch on the highlights here. So without adoption of this ordinance, the city can't participate in this National Flood Insurance Program, which provides the most affordable rates to the consumers. But more importantly, the city would face, and the residents would face the penalty of not having federal disaster assistance in the event of a flood, and also not being able to qualify or purchase for federally backed mortgage insurance or loan guarantees. So for those reasons and many more, the city is proceeding with this and the FEMA requirements. So the ordinance is really a standard ordinance implemented through building permits that serves to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare. It's preventative measures that are imposed during construction, largely. FEMA, in working with the state of California, developed a model ordinance that meets their strict requirements, so we followed that model ordinance. But I do want to emphasize that this was an ordinance that we did collaborate with FEMA, because the city had a few minor modifications that we wanted to make to the ordinance to ensure our interests were voiced. And this final ordinance has been reviewed by FEMA and determined to meet their requirements. And it was something I want to emphasize that we went back and forth with FEMA on many times, so it has been something we've been working on for several months. So the ordinance will accomplish some primary items. It will establish the city's floodplain management requirements for construction and land uses. It will designate our chief building official, who's here tonight, as the floodplain administrator. It will also set up provisions for variances and appeals should property owners seek those, and have an appeals board. And it will also adopt the maps. That's kind of one of the key features that's not inherently obvious. But I want to point that out because it was one of the modifications that we requested to make. The model ordinance didn't include any language related to the city's right to challenge and appeal future revisions. And so we inserted that language, and it was accepted by FEMA that we will obviously want to preserve that right to challenge and appeal any future revisions. So the ordinance would, again, set the minimum construction standards, and those are the real heart of the ordinance, is that if someone were to propose new construction, they would be regulations that would be applied depending on the scope of the project. So I'll highlight some of the projects that would trigger this ordinance, but I want to emphasize not all projects would necessarily trigger these requirements. And the main thing is there's construction methods, which are industry-wide, used throughout the country where there is flooding. There are various sources, and so the heart of it is sort of different construction materials, methods of construction that will minimize flood damage. And there is a certification process, so ultimately through the construction process, prior to the city issuing a final final of the building permits is issued, often there's a validation through a registered civil engineer and architect who can provide the validation process. So some of the examples of the sort of more typical construction standards and requirements are that new residential structures are designed to have that lowest floor level raised to be at or above what's called the base flood elevation. So you can see that picture here. Sometimes it's a more traditional home design where the home has a porch that's elevated and crawl space, so it isn't necessarily an atypical construction, but the goal is to raise that first flood level above the base flood elevation. But as many of you know, when you have sort of a basement, you might put some utilities, things like some furnace down there. And so there's also an element of sort of trying to flood proof what's typically found underneath the house in the crawl space. So you can see the example here, and some of this again is not necessarily that atypical. Just in the course of construction, a lot of folks do want a raised elevation. So the ordinance applies, as I said, to new construction. The classic example would be a brand new house, a brand new commercial structure, but it also is applicable if an existing home is proposing to undergo substantial improvements, and that could be any reconstruction or rehabilitation where that improvement or that construction project has a cost that equals 50% of the market value of the home. So it's possible a second story addition would trigger that, or a big first floor addition to a home. But that valuation and cost is determined by the city through the permit process. And in my experience of having administered one of these in the past, sometimes there's a back and forth with the scope of the project to bring it under this threshold. So it is something that the city kind of works with homeowners on. So again, some examples of projects that might be exempt might be a simple interior remodeling, or a first floor addition or a second story addition that wouldn't hit that substantial improvement threshold of 50%. But also there are other types of construction that don't involve human habitation, like a detached shed in someone's backyard or a garage. Those wouldn't be triggered to meet these floodproofing requirements because, again, you're not necessarily exposing a huge high-value structure or humans to the exposure of flooding. Also really important to mention that the ordinance does exempt projects related to code violations if those code violations are determined to be related to like ensuring a safe and safe home for human habitation. Also important to mention, there are no city buildings that are subject to this ordinance. So that concludes my staff report. I just want to summarize the ordinance and really give you the high points. I know it's a very long ordinance, but I want to emphasize that most of it did come from the model ordinance by FEMA. So while we work to make a few minor modifications that we think are in the city's best interests, much of the text of that ordinance is very technical language that came from the model ordinance. But that concludes my staff report, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have or refer them to the other city staff in attendance tonight.
We do have a speaker card.
Robert Rico.
Robert Rico, 7th Avenue. I want to thank Jimmy and his staff and everybody that's been working on this for so long, including Jackie Spears' office and Dave Pine. My main question is, what is the next steps that the city is going to take to get the needed information to all the people in the affected area in English and Spanish? And are there going to be any meetings or workshops to hold everybody's hand or hold those hands that need to be held as this goes forth so that we can partake of the reduced cost for insurance going forward? And the other half of it, how is the city going to follow up with the city of South San Francisco, the airport, the county, so that someday in the future everybody will have done their work so that FEMA can come in and say, you don't need flood insurance any longer?
Thank you. Any other comments, Brian? Did you want to say anything? Or? We're going to have Brian come to the...
Good evening, Brian Perkins, Congresswoman Jackie Spears' office. With respect to Mr. Rico's question, I don't know what the city's going to do to follow up, but traditionally what happens is the lenders themselves send out notices within about 90 days and inform the borrowers of the requirement. And they also inform the borrowers of the opportunity to buy, in effect, discounted insurance for that and to get in on that discount opportunity. That seems to work pretty well to get most of the folks involved in it, and we've had a few of these that I'm aware of in our district and across the state. It seems to work pretty well. There are hitches that come up. As Mr. Rico pointed out, language is sometimes a problem. There's also the problem sometimes that the actual owner isn't in the home. It may be a relative who doesn't recognize the importance of this piece of mail, and they throw it out instead of giving it to the borrower. Ultimately, if the insurance isn't bought, and usually within the first year, the borrower discovers a new charge on their insurance, on their mortgage, and that is a charge for flood insurance. It's a forced placed policy by the lender. It's actually quite expensive, and that usually gets the attention of the borrower. And then if the borrower still doesn't make the purchase, then again, this is outside of anything the city might do. The borrower might, in fact, lose the opportunity to buy grandfathered priced insurance. So that's kind of the downside of the current process. But it is, at least in my experience, it's always that notice from the borrower, from the lender to the borrower that really is a wake-up call for everybody. And our phones will light up, and I'll spend a lot of time talking to people, and folks will say they never heard about it before and so forth. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anything
Happy
else?
to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Brian. Anything else from staff, Tad?
Sure. I'll actually have Jimmy come up to talk about the notification, but we have purposely held off on another round of notifications until the April 5th date when homeowners can purchase the discounted insurance, because a lot of communication happened. We feel like there's information out there in the community about it, and we really wanted that next communication to be action-oriented. And so we've held off in this intermediate time when we're working with FEMA on taking the necessary steps now that we lost the appeal and we have to move forward with the implementation process. A part of the other part of the question is what are we doing to partner with South San Francisco and SFO? To council, there's a number of things that are happening. One, there's the navigational slough, where there was right now an expired MOU between the county and South San Francisco to look at strategies for that slough, because while that slough is not within San Bruno, flooding of that slough could very much affect San Bruno. And so we did partially fund a study, and now that that study is done, it will be looking towards implementation, and there are conversations happening between South San Francisco and the city of San Bruno and the county on how to further that work. In addition, with the county's effort to establish a new agency that is I'm going to get it wrong, but the Flood Control and Sea Level Rise Resiliency Agency, plus a couple more acronyms. There are a number of efforts as a part of that new agency that is trying to get started that will help out with flood control, and as a part of that agency, the county is putting up about half of the operating costs for the first 3 years and asking for the cities to put up the other half. Our portion is $40,000 annually for the next 3 years, and I think coming up we're going to have a presentation by Larry Patterson on that, and with council direction we will include that $40,000 in the next year budget and the next 3-year budgets. And as a part of that agency, I know the county is working to not only get the 20 cities in the county to join, but to get SFO to be a partner in that agency as well. And so I think all the conversations are happening, but they're very long-term strategies. And did I miss anything, Jimmy?
Good evening again. So the city manager is correct. The city has been coordinating with South San Francisco and as well as San Mateo County regards to the Navigable Slough project. The study has been completed, the next phase of work is to look for grant opportunities for some funding for the next phase of work, which is the design and then eventually construction of some of the improvements that are indicated in the report. In addition, the staff has been coordinating with the San Francisco Airport. There's a meeting that's being set up by their engineer as well as myself to discuss their project, which is the shoreline protection plan that they're putting together for the entire 8 miles of their surrounding their airport. So that's something that we're looking forward to having our engineers attend the meeting to learn more about what they're doing and their schedule for those projects. But the city is continuing to coordinate with the county of San Mateo as well. And we still need to also coordinate with the city of Millbrae because there's a location where a portion of the water does travel through from the Millbrae and up San Bruno. So that's something that we'll be looking into in the near future to coordinate with our neighboring agency. Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, I think it's appropriate at this point, because I know folks are watching this show, that to mention that the flood insurance at the moment under current law is a little bit under $500 per year if you get in for the grandfathered rate, and then they add on a $25 flat charge. And so the total charge, I always have to remind myself, is about $500 to start. And then it escalates from there until it gets to a full rate. And it takes about a decade for it to get up to the full price. The full price is not uniform by house. It's really dependent upon how high your house is flooded on the interior. So it's hard to tell any individual homeowner without them checking with their own engineer or with their insurance agent what the final rate would be. But the range of increase can be from 5% to about 15% or 18% per year. I always get those mixed up. So it's it's not $1 million to start, but it does go up at a fairly substantial rate, because even 5% is more than folks on a fixed income, for example, can take. And we certainly would like to help the city at any time with any federal grant opportunities and writing letters of support and so forth. And and we're also working with the airport on their project as well. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of places that are leaking. That's basically what it boils down to. So.
Thank you. Questions of council?
Not a question, but I made a comment. I just want to make sure that Brian and Jackie both know that we appreciate all the efforts they've been. I started out way in the beginning with Dave Pine that we weren't even as a city notified of all this was happening, and then the supervisor and our senator worked together, and here we are. So thank you very much, and we'll keep on trucking.
And Brian, while you're here, what are some possibilities on grant funding for this program?
Well, Mr. Tan alluded to it. The FEMA's most likely source is hazard mitigation grants that would happen. There's also a chance to use federal grants through the Army Corps of Engineers. That's a longer-term strategy, and it really comes about as a result of this cooperative effort across the entire county, where you can give the Army Corps a nice, resolved solution for a large part of the property. But we know that it happens because this is exactly what's going down in the Alviso neighborhood in San Jose. And in fact, when I was out at the Bel Air School, someone said, gee, Senator Feinstein just got San Jose, I forgot what the amount of money was. It was quite a bit of millions. And I said, yeah, that's because they started 25 years ago with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they've been working on it, and this is just the latest phase. If you have one of these county-wide proposals that resolves a lot of issues, then you can go to Congress, you compete against the Mississippi River, you can compete against the Allegheny River and all these other sorts of things, but you're competitive at that point. And that's why Congresswoman Spear has been so insistent that we get a county-wide agency so that we actually get in a position to get all of this federal money that's otherwise going around the country. But these are long-term choices. It's not uncommon for it to take a decade in order to get one of those particular programs going. There are smaller Army Corps projects that are available, and that Mr. Tan and I will be talking about, I'm sure, soon. But ironically, most of that effort would have to be made by the property owners, which in this case are other jurisdictions and not San Bruno. So they'll have to make their own choices regarding how aggressive they are, and I'm sure they'll cooperate. But does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Please.
Thank you very much. This is a recurring item where we are imposed some conditions, and the city pretty much has no opportunity to, and we did fight it, but
Yes, we did.
and we have to deal with the consequence of not winning and dealing with this. So thank you for the internal in-house municipal code, the new set of, what's the proper term for it? What are you calling it?
Floodplain management regulations.
Okay, for that. Done in-house, no consultant needed for that, right? Great. In the presentation, you mentioned something about the appeal board. I just wanted to make sure, where is that something that the city will need to have an appeal board, or is that that our appeal goes to FEMA? Is it?
No, it's a city appeal board consisting of myself, the community services director, and the public works director, and it would be an appeal board of the administrator's decision. So we have similar appeal boards set forth,
Okay.
and we find them to be an expeditious way to convene a board of city staff to review any appeal.
Okay, thank you. This definitely pertains to ADUs. If somebody was putting an ADU in their backyard, they would have to make sure it was at the right heights and so forth. This is for everything that's new. So it's fine for somebody that has a house the way it is now. You're just going to have to get the insurance in the event you have that loan. Last thing is the timeline again. It was April 5th, right? That's when
That's when the new maps are effective.
and they have to have the insurance by when?
We think 1 year.
Well, to qualify for the discount, they'll have to buy it within the year, but as a matter of contract with their mortgage company, they really have to have it almost immediately, which is why the notices start to go out.
Got it.
Within 90 days.
I just wanted to confirm, we were going to send a notice out on the 5th?
We are going to ramp up our communication efforts around the date of the 5th. It will.
Okay.
I'm not.
No, just
I
curious
don't want to
where
outline
that's
the
gonna be
process,
at.
but yeah.
And we'll have a prominent place on our website, of course, and handouts for new construction. It'll be, okay, all right. So just concerned about people always, I didn't know about it, and what am I going to do about it? So we did our part, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments from council? For this action, there are two things. We would need a motion and a second to waive the first reading.
So moved.
Second?
Melissa?
Councilmember Davis?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar?
Aye.
Vice Mayor O'Connell?
Aye.
Mayor Medina?
Aye. And then if we need somebody to introduce the ordinance, please.
I'll introduce the ordinance.
Second.
Councilmember Davis?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar?
Aye.
Vice Mayor O'Connell?
Aye.
Mayor Medina?
Aye. Thank you. Brian, thank you for being here.